In the late 1930s, the United States was a nation looking inward. The economy was still struggling to recover from the Great Depression, and public opinion remained firmly against any involvement in foreign military conflicts. Domestic life was defined by rigid social boundaries. Over 80% of Americans believed married women should not hold jobs outside the home, and racial segregation was the standard in nearly every aspect of public life. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, ended that era of isolation in a single morning. The destruction in Hawaii made the threat of global war an immediate domestic reality. To fight on two separate fronts, the country had to generate a massive industrial output. This required the government to retool the entire economy for military production almost overnight. This level of production was impossible without a unified workforce. President Roosevelt understood that if the nation was to function as a global superpower, the government would have to create an engineered unity among its divided citizens. The government established the Office of War Information to manage this effort. Its goal was to use every form of media to align the American public's daily habits with the demands of total war. Popular culture became a tool for morale. Comic books like this one reached millions, providing a clear narrative of the conflict and identifying the Axis powers as a direct threat to the American way of life. Shared initiatives, such as these scrap drives, brought the war into local neighborhoods. By collecting metal and rubber, the government ensured that every citizen felt their contribution was essential to the supply chain. Despite this enthusiasm, a labor crisis loomed. As millions of men were drafted into military service, factories faced a shortage of workers at the exact moment production needs reached their peak. This poster illustrates the targeted campaigns designed to fill that critical gap. The government worked to convince women that entering defense factories was a patriotic necessity rather than a violation of social norms. Millions responded to the call. By 1943, women made up over a third of the nation's ammunition workers and 40% of the aircraft industry, performing heavy labor on a national scale. This factory floor, packed with Sherman tanks, represents the physical result of that mobilization. By successfully producing these machines at this scale, women proved their industrial capacity was a matter of opportunity, not ability. This mobilization exposed a deep national irony. The United States was promoting democratic freedom to the world while enforcing racial inequality within its own borders. This image of African American soldiers reflects the spirit of the WWII campaign. Activists demanded two victories, one over fascism abroad and another over racism at home. The government's desperate need for labor gave these activists leverage. To avoid a massive protest during the war, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which legally prohibited racial discrimination in the defense industry. These Tuskegee Airmen were among the thousands who seized these new opportunities. Their performance in combat provided undeniable proof of military excellence, even as they faced prejudice within their own ranks. These four shipyard workers represent a broader demographic shift. The war brought over 1 million African Americans into industrial centers and shipyards, establishing a new economic presence in the nation's manufacturing hubs. The demand for labor moved millions of people into new roles and regions. These shifts established a social and economic baseline that made a return to the pre-war status quo impossible, setting the stage for the coming civil rights era. But the same machinery used to unite the public also had a darker application. The government began using its communication channels to encourage a culture of vigilance that quickly turned into suspicion. Political and military leaders directed this suspicion toward Japanese Americans on the West Coast, regardless of their citizenship or history of loyalty. This document is Executive Order 9066. It granted the military the power to designate specific areas as military zones, authorizing the exclusion of any person without a declaration of martial law. Under this order, more than 112,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their communities. They were permitted to bring only what they could carry before being guarded by armed soldiers. These rows of uniform barracks became home for thousands of families. These internment camps were built in remote, desolate locations where citizens were confined by barbed wire for years. This text details the conviction of Fred Korematsu. He challenged the exclusion, and his case eventually reached the Supreme Court. In the majority opinion, Justice Black argued the detention was a military necessity, prioritizing perceived dangers of espionage over individual rights. This policy remains a permanent lesson in how civil liberties can be sacrificed when institutional prejudice is allowed to direct national policy during a time of panic. This diagram shows the reach of American influence after the war. By 1945, the nation produced half of the world's goods and maintained a military footprint in every theater of the conflict. As the fighting ended, there was a concerted effort to return to 1930 social norms. Women were urged to leave factories for returning veterans, and many wartime programs were dismantled. However, the internal landscape of the country had shifted. The home front experiences changed how millions of Americans viewed their place in society. Women had successfully maintained the nation's industrial output, creating an impossible-to-erase precedent for their role in the labor force. Minorities had demonstrated their indispensable value to national survival, giving the arguments for civil rights a new, undeniable weight in the post-war era. And the memory of internment served as a lasting warning about the potential for executive overreach when constitutional rights are set aside. The American home front operated like an intense forge. It forced the country to arm the world while grappling with its own internal divisions, resulting in a society that was far more powerful, yet far more aware of its contradictions than the one that had existed before the war.